Good evening. This is Forum Daily for Friday, August the 15th. I'm Hal Roberts, filling in for Theresa Skubic. U.S. President Donald Trump was set to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin at a summit in Alaska today. On Thursday, Trump admitted that the meeting could go either way and could end quickly if there is pushback from the Russian leader. Putin, meanwhile, praised Trump's efforts to end the war in Ukraine more than 3 years after Moscow launched its invasion. Now, for more on this, I chatted with our correspondent Wyatt Sharp, who joined me from the White House earlier today. So, Wyatt, some see the summit as legitimizing Russia's position without Ukraine being present. What kind of a message does that really send to the world about diplomatic norms?
Yeah, I think a lot of people who are obviously looking at what's taking place here are concerned about Ukraine's involvement, although I will say President Trump came out this morning and said that any decisions about possible territory or land swaps would obviously have to have Ukraine at the table. So obviously President Trump still recognizing the importance of Ukrainian independence and of Ukrainian sovereignty. Perhaps not as much as someone like Volodymyr Zelensky would like, though. Of course, he was advocating, as were many other European leaders, for Zelensky to actually be present at the meeting himself. Now, President Trump saying this meeting in Alaska is really an opportunity to get Vladimir Putin to hopefully eventually agree to a trilateral meeting between the three of them, so that maybe then they can ultimately discuss, some ways or some means essentially to end this conflict. But remember, this is the first time that the two have met ever since Russia escalated its invasion to a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. So I think the fact that they're meeting is significant enough, although Russian state media going into the meeting, they were making, taking some shots, so to speak, at the United States by saying, it's just one example that Alaska is actually a part of Russia, not the United States. So some people in the United States, I think, are a little bit concerned that maybe this meeting could go poorly. It could go perhaps maybe similar to what we saw with President Zelensky in the Oval Office here at the White House. So again, I think people are cautiously optimistic about the meeting in terms of what could come out of it. But in terms of, how likely it is to actually, from this one meeting itself, put an end to the conflict, seemingly is unlikely.
Maybe some people need to be reminded that Alaska was purchased a very long time ago.
For $143 million, yes.
There you go. Now, Wyatt, given Putin's history of using private meetings to really gain leverage, how concerned should we really be about the influence he could have on U.S. policy moving forward?
I think right now he definitely is in a position to kind of negotiate, so to speak, which sounds unfortunate because he is the aggressor in this conflict. Russia is certainly the aggressor in this conflict. But again, he is the one who has, greater military power, who has greater, funding power. Ukraine has a decent amount of funding, but that's because they've been receiving it from countries around the world. And so, if you're talking about it from that perspective, I think it's fair to mention that, well, it might not be, something that should be celebrated. Russia still definitely has a decent amount of leverage, or at least more than people are letting on with respect to this conflict. In terms of what they want, that's been kind of the big question throughout this conflict, because some people have been saying, do they want more land? Because they're already, one of the biggest countries, second biggest country in terms of land mass. Is it really fair to say that they want more land? And so people are questioning that. Some people say maybe it's just a power thing for Vladimir Putin as well. And so if either of those two circumstances are true, it's hard to see a world where he's doing this just to influence U.S. policy, just because I don't really know what he would be trying to influence necessarily. Certainly the United States has been a friend of Ukraine, but I wouldn't say outside of this conflict, they've been, that consequential in terms of U.S.-Ukrainian relations.
Now, if any deal is struck that pauses the war but ignores Ukraine's sovereignty, does that really risk rewarding aggression and maybe setting a dangerous precedent moving forward?
Yeah, I think certainly if you look at some of the other geopolitical conflicts that are happening right now overseas, that's a big concern, right? Because if you look even to the war between Israel and Hamas, that's one example of another geopolitical conflict. I will say President Trump has done some work to put some end to some conflicts. He's joked that he should nominate himself for the Nobel Peace Prize. But as much of a joke as it is, even have people like Hillary Clinton who have came out and said, if Donald Trump puts an end to the war in Ukraine, then sure, we can nominate him. So I think that kind of speaks to the fact that people don't actually think he himself is going to be the one to achieve a ceasefire in Ukraine. Maybe he can help work with Vladimir Putin to try and calm him down a little bit. But the chances of a full-blown kind of ceasefire solely because of Donald Trump, I think, is unlikely. But yeah, you're certainly right. And it does, I think, kind of raise, a precedent that if he were to kind of bow down, and if Ukraine were to bow down to the concessions and what Russia wants, it could set a dangerous precedent. So I think really you have to balance this idea of how do we put an end to the conflict without totally sacrificing their sovereignty.
So could U.S.-Russia talks like this, Wyatt, really maybe potentially weaken NATO or even split Western unity over time?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's another thing Vladimir Putin has said that part of the reason this conflict started was because of Ukraine's threat to join NATO, right? And so that was something that, right now they're getting a lot of support from countries within NATO and they're not a part of NATO. So if they were a member of NATO, the support that they're receiving would be far greater, I think, as well. It's fair to say that. But yeah, I mean, I think right now a lot of the concern that's coming from the Russians is that whether it's countries like Russia, whether it's countries like Belarus, I mean, countries who have generally speaking not sided with kind of this liberal form of democracy that we know well in places like Canada, the United States, etc. Russia is trying to look for partners in this. And so when they see a country like Ukraine going against what they want and standing for democratic values, they, try and put an end to that, especially when it's geopolitically kind of closely, located next to them. So there's certainly, I think, an aspect of that. And then again, I think part of it is just Vladimir Putin's own kind of territorial ambitions. He wants to expand Russia. But again, I mean, I think he's just kind of an unpredictable figure. And so it's hard to make kind of a reasonable prognostication at this point as to what it is exactly that he's looking for.
Now, when you're talking to some of the Trump administration officials, and if they're really concerned about maybe perhaps the peace talks will fall apart between Russia and Ukraine, is there also talk and maybe reports that potentially Putin would want to reunite the USSR, not just going after Ukraine, but some of the other former states?
I mean, I think certainly the comment that he made towards Alaska is an example that he's willing to do anything. I think he, going after Ukraine, indicating that he might rather go after Poland as well if, he is successful with his invasion of Ukraine. So yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly what he wants to do. And I wouldn't, write off anything that he wants to do because I think right now a lot of what he's trying to do is very much in the cards for him if it wasn't for the support of, again, countries who are already in NATO, other G7 countries as well. So that's certainly part of it. But I mean, I do think that at this point in time, part of the concern really just comes down to how do we balance actually ensuring, again, as I said before, that democracy can be protected while also not allowing this conflict to go on for longer than it should.
Correspondent Wyatt Sharp, thanks so much for joining us today from the White House.
Thank you.
An emergency restraining order is being sought in Washington to block U.S. President Donald Trump's takeover of the local police department. District of Columbia Attorney General Brian Schwab filed the lawsuit earlier today. This follows Attorney General Pam Bondi being named an emergency police commissioner by Trump with all of the powers of a police chief. Schwab says Trump is going beyond his legal power at the nation's capital. Schwab says he wants a judge to find control of Washington police in district hands. The terrorist group Hezbollah says there could be a civil war and warns that there will be no life in Lebanon if the government moves forward to try and eliminate them. Government officials say they want to control arms in line with an American-backed plan following Israel's war against Hezbollah, which began around 40 years ago with the backing of Tehran's Revolutionary Guard. The terrorist group says they will not disarm and won't even consider it until Israel ends its strikes and occupation of a Hezbollah stronghold in southern Lebanon. The IDF has devastated Hezbollah over the past couple of years, killing many of its top officials, including former leader Hassan Nasrallah, along with around 5,000 of its fighters. More reports are surfacing about the residents of Gaza struggling to get enough water for drinking and sanitation. Experts are warning that far less than the minimum needed to sustain life is reaching the region. More than 2 million people in the enclave face shortages even before the war between Israel and Hamas broke out. They relied on Israeli electricity to power desalination and wastewater treatment plants. Displaced families now reuse water for dishes and bathing. People are crowding around hoses from water trucks to carry supplies home in the sweltering heat. Officials say water and sanitation touch virtually every part of the humanitarian crisis in the area, and the shortages have helped fuel the rampant spread of disease. Federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is again calling on Ottawa to act as a Chinese tariff of nearly 76% on Canadian canola seed will have a major impact on our farmers.
As carne fails abroad, Canadians pay the price at home. Here in Canada, things are not changing as he promised they would. In fact, they are actually getting worse. In replacing Justin Trudeau, he claimed that things would be different. Well, they're different only in that they continue to worsen. There have been many grand announcements, high-profile meetings, and grand statements, but none of the results promised. Government spending is growing faster than ever. faster than when Justin Trudeau was Prime Minister. Inflation and the cost of living continue to rise. Housing costs, which had already doubled, are now rising faster than before. And we see that the home building numbers are worse today, even after Carney promised that he would double them.
Poilievre is repeating his call for Prime Minister Mark Carney to cancel a $1 billion federal loan given to BC Ferries, which is purchasing Chinese-made ships, accusing the Prime Minister of not caring enough about agriculture producers. Canada's agriculture and international trade ministers have said they remain steady to address trade concerns with China. Coming up next, we'll have the latest on the potential work stoppage for Air Canada's flight attendants. Stay with us. More cancellations were expected today for Air Canada and Air Canada Rouge flights. The airline says that 500 flights previously scheduled to take off today were impacted. That was in anticipation of a work stoppage by flight attendants, with a full stoppage potentially kicking in on Saturday. More than 10,000 flight attendants are poised to walk off the job at around 1 a.m. Eastern Time Saturday, followed by a company-imposed lockout if the two sides cannot reach an 11th-hour deal later tonight. An off-duty flight attendant who helped passengers escape and suffered her own injuries during a fiery upside-down crash of a Delta Airlines flight at Toronto's Pearson Airport has filed a $75 million U.S. lawsuit against the airline. Our contributor David Clement has that story.
In a dramatic turn in aviation safety news, a veteran flight attendant is suing Delta Airlines for a staggering $75 million U.S. over the terrifying plane crash at Toronto's Pearson International Airport that left the aircraft upside down and engulfed in flames. The lawsuit filed in Michigan paints a picture of corporate negligence that allegedly prioritized profits over passenger lives. The plaintiff, 67-year-old Vanessa Miles, was an off-duty flight attendant for Endeavour Air, operating as Delta Connection, when disaster struck on February 17th. She was, quote, deadheading as a passenger on Flight 4819, a Bombardier CRJ 900, en route from Minneapolis to Toronto. According to the suit, the plane bounced violently on landing, rolled over, and came to a rest inverted with one wing torn off and a fire erupting. Now, miraculously, all 80 people on board survived, but more than 20 were rushed to hospitals with injuries. Miles describes a nightmarish ordeal. Knocked unconscious and dangling upside down from her seatbelt, she awoke surrounded by thick smoke and drenched in leaking jet fuel, fearing chemical burns, suffocation, or worse. Her injuries are severe and life-altering: a fractured left shoulder and scapula, traumatic brain injury, post-concussion syndrome, bilateral knee and back damage, exposure to toxic fumes, and deep psychological scars, including anxiety, depression, and PTSD. The lawsuit accuses Delta of assigning an inexperienced and inadequately trained pilot to the flight, showing reckless disregard for passenger safety in pursuit of operational efficiency. It alleges that the airline rushed pilots through training to cut corners and lists a litany of failures, including improper emergency evacuation equipment, no announcements during the chaos, shoddy maintenance of the landing gear, delayed medical aid, and inadequate response procedures overall. But Delta has fired back, defending its crew. The airline says the captain, hired in 2007, has extensive experience as a pilot, trainer, safety expert, while the first officer hired last year and trained by April 2024 far exceeded federal requirements. Both are fully FAA certified, and Delta dismisses claims of training shortcomings as false. A spokesperson declined further comment, citing the ongoing litigation and an investigation by Canada's Transportation Safety Board, whose final report isn't due until next year. Now, Miles' attorney, Madeline Sinkovich, told reporters, quote, "Our complaint alleges that basic safeguards, training, and evacuation procedures failed, and that corporate decisions put cost and schedule ahead of safety." Adding to the story, Miles was honored in April with the CB Lansing Memorial Award for Heroism Beyond the Call of Duty, recognizing her and other off-duty crew who helped evacuate passengers despite the peril. This case proceeds under the Montreal Convention, which holds airlines liable for onboard injuries, and it's not alone. At least 16 other passenger lawsuits have been filed over the crash. As the TSB probe continues, questions about airline safety standards loom large. Will this lead to broader reforms? We'll be watching for more. Back to you.
Prime Minister Mark Carney's office is continuing to hunt for a local constituency office for the Prime Minister that meets his security requirements. The search comes as Carney has yet to have his own office in his Nepean riding more than 100 days after the spring election. The PMO's Director of Media Relations, Emily Williams, says that until a local office is set up, residents of Nepean can access federal services through Defence Minister David McGuinty's office. Ontario public servants will be required to return to the office full-time next year, with employees going in person 5 days a week beginning in January. Treasury Board President Caroline Mulroney says the province has been monitoring in-workplace standards across the public and private sectors, and the decision represents the current workforce landscape. Employees who have been going into the office for a minimum of 3 days will have to increase their attendance to 4 starting October 20th and then transition to 5 by January 5th of 2026. A new survey shows that 34% of renters spend more than half of their income on rent, even as the rental market has cooled off somewhat. Rentals.ca's report shows that those who spend more than half of their income are more likely to experience longer search times, higher frustration, and even consider moving to another city. Despite the financial hardship, the survey found 66% of those spending big on rent still say they don't want a roommate. For younger renters between the ages of 18 and 24, about half of them spend more than 50% of their income on rent, and that a common budget range for monthly rent among this group is $1,000 to $1,499. The report, which surveyed 510 renters across the country, says only 22% of respondents were spending 30% or less of their income on rent, which is often considered the affordability benchmark. According to the study, BC led the way for the most expensive one-bedroom condo rental at $2,173. Ontario was next at $2,078. Nova Scotia, surprisingly, was third at $2,018. Quebec was fourth at $1,694. Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan rounded out the top 7 in the country. The national average asking rent in July fell 3.6% from a year earlier to $2,121, which marked the 10th straight month of year-over-year declines. A new survey from the Bank of Canada shows that Canadians are keeping more cash in their wallets in an increasingly digital world. The central bank says its 2024 survey on payment methods shows Canadians kept an average of $156 in cash on hand, up from 2023. Those surveys suggest around 20% of their purchases were made via cash. Mobile payments are also gaining traction, accounting for almost 5% of purchases in 2024. Payments have begun rolling out for the first claimants in a First Nations child welfare case. The $23 billion settlement will impact more than 300,000 First Nations children and their families. The settlement is meant to compensate children and their families for Canada's chronic underfunding of on-reserve child welfare services. Individuals who were removed from their families on reserves or in the Yukon between April 1st of 1991 and March 31st of 2022, along with their parents or grandparents, are now eligible to apply for and receive payments. The chief of the Heiltsuk Nation of British Columbia says that more needs to be done to stop racial profiling of Indigenous people when they shop. Marilyn Slett says that can include actions like following people around a store or refusing to serve them. The nation commissioned a report on consumer racial profiling of Indigenous people that makes 8 recommendations, including calls for more research, better training, and better corporate policies. It calls racial profiling a neglected human rights issue. Governor General Mary Simon delivered remarks at Waves 25, which is the Global Indigenous Languages Summit. Organized by the Office of the Commissioner of Indigenous Languages, the event brings together language supporters from around the world every year to celebrate the work of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities.
Reconciliation is not easy. It means having hard conversations and listening to truth that should never have been. It also demands action to dismantle the barriers that have historically divided us. Supporting Indigenous languages through education is one such action.
Federal Procurement Minister Joel Lightbound announced the site for a new facility devoted to cultural heritage science in Gatineau, Quebec on Thursday. Joining the minister on stage was Verna McGregor, an Algonquin elder from a First Nation, who spoke on the relevance of the center and the importance of combining science and culture.
Because this cultural heritage and the blending also too as well of science is very important, because we've been left out of this too as part of this journey, and here we are, and I think this is part of reconciliation, because what the elders would say too, this reconciliation goes deeper too. It's not just, it includes, yes, we as the original people of the land here, but also too as well, what about other nations? And other nations is not just human nations. It's the ones that fly, the ones that crawl, the four-legged. And in our understanding, that's nations, because our creation story here included or was big emphasis on the caretaking of the lands.
Coming up, details on a wildfire evacuation for a suburb in St. John's, Newfoundland that's lifted, and an update on a fire activities ban in Saskatchewan. Stay with us. Those who were forced from their homes by a wildfire near St. John's, Newfoundland were allowed to return home today. Provincial officials say the evacuation order issued earlier this week for a suburb of St. John's was lifted. A government release, however, says that residents are still under an evacuation alert, which means they must be ready to leave at a moment's notice. A social media post by the town of Paradise says that Paddy's Pond wildfire is still considered an active fire, with emergency crews continuing to work at the scene. Officials also announced that the Kingston wildfire destroyed around 100 structures, including many homes, along with a 60-student elementary school in Western Bay. Wildfire officials in Saskatchewan, meanwhile, have lifted a provincial fire ban due to cooler, wet weather. The Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency says the ban was lifted late Wednesday for all Crown lands located north of the provincial forest boundary. Several areas in Saskatchewan and Manitoba have spent the summer under one or more fire bans due to devastating wildfires that have forced thousands of people from their homes. White House advisor Peter Navarro spoke to the media outlining the justification behind U.S. President Donald Trump's executive order on pharmaceutical imports.
The reality here, the top line is that Americans' medicine cabinets can't be dependent on foreign imports. We know that there's big supply chain resilience issues there. And so what this executive order yesterday does is address this problem in three different ways. The top line here is we're creating a strategic advanced pharmaceutical ingredient reserve. We're number one. Number two, we are trying to stabilize long-term demand through long-term contracts from the government, which is the biggest buyer of pharmaceuticals. And three, the broader issue of regulatory reform, we are going to make it much easier for advanced manufacturing, continuous manufacturing to occur here and make us competitive. So that's kind of the thrust of the EO. Now, here's the backstory for the American people. You have a process which goes in three stages. You have precursor chemicals, which are then turned into what's called advanced pharmaceutical ingredients. Historically, what we've had is a problem where, because of the dumping and unfair trade practices of foreign countries, we have not been good at the precursor chemicals or the API.
California Governor Gavin Newsom has announced a special election for November the 4th to approve redrawn districts. The move aims to gain 5 more U.S. House seats for Democrats. It's a response to a similar Republican effort in Texas led by Donald Trump. Newsom launched the campaign on Thursday in Los Angeles, framing it as a battle against Trump and for democracy. California's new map would only take effect if a Republican state proceeds with redrawing a district.
We'll be asking for the people on November 4th, a special election coinciding with a lot of local municipal elections, to provide a temporary pathway for congressional maps. We will affirm our commitment to the state independent redistricting after the 2030 census, but we're asking the voters for their consent to do midterm redistricting in 2026, 2028, and 2030 for the congressional maps, to respond to what's happening in Texas, to respond what Trump is trying to excite. And we'll do so in a way that also affirms our desire as a state to level the playing field all across the United States. We believe in a national independent redistricting framework. And we believe that's the right goal and the right thing to pursue. Zoe Lofgren, who runs our California delegation, she authored the bill. Democrats unanimously supported that National Independent Redistricting Commission. Republicans were nowhere to be found. They want to rig these elections, and they want the power that gerrymandering provides, because they know what Donald Trump knows. He's going to lose the midterms. He knows de facto his presidency ends in 17 months.
American Eagle recently launched its Great Jeans campaign starring actress Sydney Sweeney. Now, that triggered backlash over a pun on jeans that critics claimed echoed eugenics imagery. Critics have argued the ad promotes narrow beauty standards, while supporters view it as harmless wordplay. We sat down with Morgan Westcott, the Associate Dean of Marketing Management Programs at the BC Institute of Technology, to discuss if American Eagle intentionally courted controversy with this campaign and whether brands should pursue such provocative strategies in the future.
I wasn't in the boardrooms and the pitch rooms when this was developed, but I think it would be pretty naive to say that American Eagle had no idea that there would be any controversy with their choices. These things are weighed really carefully when we're choosing a spokesperson. And again, we're thinking about target audience, we're thinking about demographics. But certainly, I think companies do want to be discussed, right? They want to become relevant. And for a company that, had lost a lot of currency and relevance, especially with young people, they seem to have achieved an agenda there for sure, in terms of getting those mentions and their Instagram stats, all of the press that's been generated by this campaign. I would say in that particular regard, they've been successful.
Now, we also asked Westcott how brands like American Eagle can really balance edgy marketing to gain viral traction while avoiding perceptions of cultural sensitivity.
One of the interesting things I think about this controversy is initially when this line was launched with Sydney as a spokesperson, there was a charitable cause attached to it. So Sydney Sweeney appeared in a film, and the protagonist in the film had been the victim and was a survivor of domestic violence. And so one of the jeans had a butterfly symbol. There was a whole tie-in with this, and somehow that's gotten lost. And so I'm not really clear on, why the company hasn't promoted that as much or spoken about that as much. And maybe it was at the insistence of the nonprofit where they said, hey, you know what, we're going to take a step back. But I feel like that was a missed opportunity to connect this excitement about the brand to something, philanthropic and something that could have been really well received by people. So I was interesting to see that fall to the wayside really quickly.
We also touched on if American Eagle's swift response was effective in shifting the narrative from outrage to conversation and what could have been done differently.
I don't see a lot of narrative shifting being crafted by the company. And I would say, again, I'm not sure how deliberate that was. I don't know how prepared they were. I mean, the word viral is the word we use for a reason, right? And so when you unleash something, it does tend to take on a life of its own. And sometimes, companies aren't maybe able to find, to use the same metaphor, an antidote, or they're not able to control how quickly things are spreading. That's all speculation at this point. I will say, when I look at what's happening, from a marketing perspective, we're trying to influence sales here. And news just came out this morning that the foot traffic to American Eagle stores is still down 9% actually over last year. So again, when we see more mentions and we see controversy and we see press and we see maybe a temporary climb in stock, we do have to balance that out with, are they selling more jeans and are they selling more product overall? Because usually one of the goals of these campaigns is to drive foot traffic to physical and online stores. And apparently that's not happening right now.
We also asked Westcott what long-term impact this controversy might have on American Eagle's brand trust, especially among younger, more socially conscious consumers.
Yeah, it's interesting that you raise younger, more socially conscious consumers because, I've even talked about how this is an ad targeted at teens and teens want to be edgy and we're recycling what Calvin Klein did with Brooke Shields. And then, when I was a teenager, Kate Moss and nothing comes between me and my Calvin. So to me, it feels a little boring, but maybe for today's teens, it does feel edgy. But of course, teens are not a homogenous group, right? There's a lot of independent sub-markets, including my own teenager, who this is not for her, right? And or her friends. And they're very socially conscious. They're very environmentally conscious. So I don't know that they would have been American Eagle consumers to begin with, but this certainly didn't help. And they won't be shopping there from what I'm gathering. So I think that, again, brands need to be precise. They have the research into who they're trying to attract, and maybe there's a game plan that I'm not seeing. But yeah, I think you are going to alienate some potential shoppers today and in the future when you take this kind of approach. And my big overall question about this campaign from the beginning has been, how sustainable is this for the company? I think, again, right, you can go viral and then the virus can be stamped out. And I think that that's something that companies really need to be aware of when they employ these kind of tactics.
Coming up, our weekly energy update from Dan McTagg, president of Canadians for Affordable Energy. Forum Daily will be back shortly. A judicial review of the potential Alberta separation referendum question will be moving forward. That's after an application to quash the proceeding and have the question be approved without scrutiny was denied. Jeffrey Rath, a lawyer for the group which proposed the question, says he's confident the question will withstand further scrutiny. The proposed question seeks to ask, do you agree that the province of Alberta shall become a sovereign country and cease to be a province in Canada? And now it's time for a weekly energy update with Dan McTagg, president of Canadians for Affordable Energy.
Well, thank you very much for this, Hal. And, we are heading quickly towards the end of August. I know it's for many people the mid part of the month, but we always have to look a week ahead here at Forum when it comes to predicting gas prices. And it looks like last week we saw, as I mentioned, about a small decrease for pretty much everyone across the country. Only because right now we're not seeing any signs of the usual disturbances that cause prices to spike. Things like hurricanes in the U.S. Gulf Coast. I see there's a little disturbance, but it's going to miss and stay in the Atlantic. So that's not really causing any concern about refinery disruption. Demand remains robust, especially in the United States where the economy is extremely strong. And so for that reason, we're seeing a bit of a crimp in supplies for diesel and for gasoline. Even oil. If you look at the weekly petroleum inventory report from the U.S. Department of Energy, it continues to show a bit of a lag where gasoline supplies are down 1 or 2%, diesel about 9 or 10%, and oil about 6 or 7% in terms of inventories and stockpiles compared to last year. But there's an expectation that with OPEC letting up on production and creating more production, that we're going to have the availability of more supply. In the summertime, it's critical how people understand that there are, in fact, two markets that are important for gasoline prices. There's the oil market, which everybody pays attention. Yeah, well, oil's dropped $5-6 a barrel, so we should be seeing a big decrease in gas prices. Not really. You don't put oil in your tank; you put refined product in your tank. It's like saying cost of lumber has dropped, but housing goes up. So the two are connected, but they're not connected necessarily in terms of the outcome, which is price. And we've seen, a moderation of gas prices, but we haven't seen them fall to the extent that we saw, in say the February of this year, March of this year, and in the off season. We're also seeing signs that diesel prices, although they have been very high, are not really letting off, and that could be a concern sign for September. I know it's a month away. When we start to think about heating oil, diesel, and at transportation, farmers taking their crops off the fields, more people turning on their furnaces, and isn't just gas, natural gas or propane. They also, in many parts of the United States, especially the U.S. Northeast and Atlantic Canada here, use heating oil. So we could start to see those price pressures move up. That's not going to happen yet. But in the meantime, a couple of geopolitical factors, I think, are going to play very heavily into the price of fuel this week. The meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin will have a lot to do with whether the United States doubles down on sanctions on pretty much everything Russian, and the continuation of really swearing away the use of any oil or natural gas from Russia. Should there be some kind of an agreement, that would probably set the market in a position where it will continue to drop the price of oil and other refined products, or what they call petroleum products. That could mean, even a greater savings than what we're seeing now in terms of prices declining. By the way, this time last year, we were looking at prices in the 180, 170, 180 range versus 130, 140. So depending where you're in the country, yes, people are complaining that it's high. But compared to this time last year, you're saving an average of 25 to 30 cents a liter. So that's pretty significant. And it's mostly because of two factors. One, oil is about $10 to $12 cheaper than it was this time last year. The Canadian dollar, although it's extraordinarily weak, 138 pennies to buy US dollar. We price all of our commodities in US terms. We're also seeing the benefit of, of what has been, for now, the temporary suspension of the carbon tax, which was about 21 cents a liter. Nevertheless, I think it's critical how a lot of people don't know there's a second carbon tax. It is very much in place across the country. It's now not only costing you more ethanol in your gasoline, which, as you know, doesn't have the same energy properties. And it's for that reason that people use gasoline infused with ethanol, and most of it is up to 15%. They will get less mileage. The efficiency isn't there. Using food to make fuel, I think, is in of itself a bit of a quandary and a bit of a concern, especially for politicians who have advocated over the past. But refineries have had to bring in more ethanol into gasoline. Most of it made in the United States, by the way. So if you think it has something to do with helping Canadian farmers, it doesn't, especially the processing of it. So let's be clear on that. Refineries in Canada have had to buy more reformulated and RFP, and of course, ethanol blend gasoline from the United States. And for that reason, we're starting to see a bit of upward pressure on things like the price of corn. Anybody bought a dozen or a baker's dozen of corn will notice this year, hey, it used to be $6, $7, $8. Now it's between 10 and 12 bucks. Even at your corner places where farmers are offering the product, food prices are much higher, not just because of the weak Canadian dollar, because all commodities are, as I mentioned earlier, priced in US dollars, but also we're displacing a lot of those food production to make fuel. And the refiners are having to do that to meet the ridiculous requirement. They reduce emissions by 30% by 2030. To do that, they have to buy carbon credits. And those carbon credits at about $250 to $500 a carbon pop equals anywhere between 9 to 18 cents a liter. Not 13 cents, but 18 cents a liter. In the case of last year, for instance, British Columbia, where they have the BC LCFS, the BC Low Carbon Fuel Standard, carbon credits in the third quarter of 2024 were almost $500. Now, according to the federal government's own regulatory impact analysis statement of 2021, when they brought in the clean fuel standard, so-called second carbon tax that I called, they said for every $110 of a carbon credit, it's 4 cents a liter. So if something's $500, you can pretty much expect that works out to 18 cents a liter plus HST or GST. So that's where we're heading, folks. You still have a carbon tax, and it's not even the industrial carbon tax, which is the OBPS, output-based pricing carbon tax. But look, as long as we consider and can continue to pursue this net zero fantasies, not only will we be subsidizing EVs that no one wants and paying it through with debt that we no longer have, we're going to continue to find our country losing ground when it comes to the value of the Canadian dollar and our purchase power. That's it for this week as far as gas price updates are concerned. But the net zero policies in this country are really having a detrimental effect on our ability to make ends meet, especially when it comes to energy.
The U.S. Supreme Court has refused for now to block enforcement of a Mississippi law aimed at regulating the use of social media by children. The case deals with an issue of growing national concern. The justices on Thursday rejected an emergency appeal from a tech industry group challenging laws passed in Mississippi and other states that require social media users to verify their ages. NetChoice, which brought the lawsuit forward, argues the Mississippi law threatens privacy rights and unconstitutionally restricts the free expression of users of all ages. The Toronto Blue Jays, fresh after taking 2 out of 3 games from the Chicago Cubs, open up a big series at home against the Texas Rangers tonight. The Jays currently sit in the top spot in the AL East as they lead the Boston Red Sox by 5 games. Chris Bassett gets the start for Toronto and is a perfect 8-0 at Rogers Centre so far this season. The Rangers have really struggled on the road, meanwhile, this season, with a record of 24-35. Overall, they're sitting right at 500 at 61-61 and are currently 3.5 games out of the wildcard spot. Meanwhile, the Blue Jays are 20 games over 500 with a record of 71-51 and are trying to win their first World Series title since 1993. International soccer star Thomas Müller arrived in Vancouver. The 35-year-old attacking midfielder spoke with the Vancouver media and hung out with the fans for the first time on Thursday after signing with the Whitecaps last week.
I got photos on this jersey. I love you, bro. I love you. Dude, just over right now. Can I take a photo with you, please?
The fans love Thomas Müller. He says that coming to Major League Soccer is a new adventure for him, but insists he remains focused on winning and that he's far from ready for retirement. Müller spent the last 17 years playing for Bayern Munich in the German Bundesliga and won 33 titles with the club, including 13 league championships. At the event on Thursday, Müller was gifted an eagle feather from the Squamish Nation.
Just like to introduce Sonomo. Leave you with this. Flying high. Bring that here. We've been waiting.
Humanoid robots hip-hop, danced, performed martial arts, and even played instruments at the opening ceremony of the first World Humanoid Robot Games in Beijing on Thursday. The competition begins today with hundreds of humanoid robots in teams from more than a dozen countries competing in soccer, boxing, and other sports. It comes as China has stepped up efforts to develop these robots powered by artificial intelligence. That'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. I'm Hal Roberts. Thanks so much for watching, and have yourself a wonderful weekend.